George Strait rebuilds fan's house destroyed by Texas flood. What he revealed shocked everyone. The water rose so fast that Martha Jenkins barely had time to grab her family photos and her dog Max before being rescued from her rooftop in San Antonio, Texas. After 43 years living in that simple house she had helped build with her late husband, in a matter of hours, the devastating flood that hit Texas in 2025 turned her entire life into muddy rubble. What started as a gentle spring rain on that Tuesday morning in April quickly became a nightmare that would change everything. Martha had been sitting in her favorite rocking chair on the front porch, listening to George Strait's Amarillo Bye morning on her old radio while watching the dark clouds gather over the horizon. At 68 years old, she had seen plenty of Texas storms, but something about this one felt different. The air was thick with an ominous tension that made Max, her loyal golden retriever, pace nervously around the yard. "Easy, boy," Martha whispered, reaching down to pet his graying muzzle. "It's just another storm." But even as she said the words, she felt a chill run down her spine. The weather reports had been warning about heavy rainfall for days, but nobody expected what was coming. By noon, the gentle patter of rain had transformed into a relentless downpour. Martha moved inside, closing the windows and checking the weather updates on her small television. The meteorologist's voice was urgent now, talking about flash flood, warnings and evacuation recommendations for low-lying areas. Her neighborhood, nestled in a valley near the San Antonio River, was directly in the path of danger. Martha's phone buzzed with a text from her son David in Seattle. "Mom, are you watching the news? Please tell me you're getting ready to leave if you need to." She smiled, despite her growing anxiety. David had been trying to convince her to move closer to him for years, especially after his father passed away 15 years ago. But this house held too many memories, too many pieces of her heart embedded in its walls. Now, if you've been enjoying this story so far, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please subscribe to our channel and let me know where you're watching from today. Your support means the world to us, and I'm curious to know if you've ever experienced a natural disaster that changed your life. Don't forget to share your thoughts about what you think will happen next in Martha's journey. As the afternoon wore on, the rain intensified beyond anything Martha had ever witnessed. Water began pooling in her backyard, slowly creeping toward the house. She gathered her most precious possessions, the family photos from the mantelpiece, important documents from the kitchen drawer, and most importantly, her weathered scrapbook documenting 5 decades of devotion to George Strait. That scrapbook represented more than just fandom. It was a chronicle of survival, of finding joy in the darkest moments of her life. Martha remembered the first time she had seen George Strait perform live. It was 1983, just 2 years after she and her husband Robert had finished building their dream home with their own hands. Robert had surprised her with tickets for their 20th wedding anniversary, knowing how much she loved country music. That night, as George sang Unwound, Martha felt something magical happen. The music seemed to speak directly to her soul, offering comfort and hope in a way she had never experienced before. The scrapbook held ticket stubs from 37 different concerts, newspaper clippings, and even the guitar pick George had thrown into the crowd during a 1997 performance in Austin. That was the only time Martha had managed to get front row seats, and she had caught that pick like it was a lifeline. She had been battling breast cancer then, and that moment of connection with her musical hero had given her strength to continue fighting. By 4 in the afternoon, the water was lapping at Martha's front steps. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, and her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, knocked frantically on her door. "Martha, we need to leave now. The authorities are going door to door telling everyone to evacuate." But Martha hesitated. Where would she go? She had no family nearby, limited savings, and Max was getting too old for sudden changes. This house was all she had left of her life with Robert. They had painted every room together, planted the oak tree in the front yard, and carved their initials in the wooden beam above the kitchen doorway. How could she just abandon it all? Her hesitation nearly cost her everything. By 5:30, the water was rushing through her front door with terrifying force. Martha found herself trapped in her own home, watching helplessly as decades of memories floated away in the muddy torrent. The water rose to her knees, then her waist, forcing her to climb onto her kitchen table and then onto the countertops. Max was barking frantically, swimming between floating furniture and debris. Martha managed to grab him and her waterproof bag containing the photos, documents, and scrapbook before the water forced her to climb into the attic. From there, she broke through to the roof, where she and Max huddled together in the pouring rain, waiting for rescue that seemed like it might never come. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of fear and disbelief. Martha watched her neighborhood transform into a lake, with only rooftops and the tops of trees visible above the churning water. Cars floated by like toys, and she could hear other residents calling for help from their own rooftops. The sound of helicopters filled the air, but they seemed so far away, so busy with other rescues. As darkness fell, Martha found herself singing softly to Max, choosing George Strait songs that had comforted her through previous crises. Check yes or no. The chair, and all my exes live in Texas, became her prayer. Her way of staying calm in the face of unimaginable loss. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was literally living through a country music tragedy, complete with losing everything she owned. Finally, around 9 o'clock at night, a rescue boat appeared through the rain and darkness. 2 volunteers helped Martha and Max climb down from the roof and into their small vessel. As they motored away from her house, Martha turned back to see only the peak of her roof visible above the waterline. Everything else, her furniture, her garden, her memories, had been swallowed by the flood. The boat took them to Roosevelt High School, which had been converted into an emergency shelter. Martha found herself in a gymnasium filled with hundreds of other flood victims, all clutching their own small bags of rescued belongings. Red Cross volunteers handed out blankets, water, and sandwiches while trying to maintain some sense of order in the chaos. Martha claimed a small space on the gymnasium floor, laying out her air mattress between an elderly man who had lost his apartment and a young mother with 2 small children. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating a harsh glare that made it impossible to forget they were sleeping in a school gym rather than their own beds. That first night, Martha couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the sounds of other people's grief, quiet sobbing, hushed phone conversations with relatives, and the occasional outburst of anger or despair. Max curled up beside her, his warmth providing the only comfort in this strange new reality. She opened her scrapbook carefully, its pages slightly damp but mostly intact. In the dim light, she could see the photos from that first concert in 1983, her and Robert's smiling faces captured in the grainy snapshot taken by a stranger. Robert had been so handsome in his western shirt and boots, his arm around her waist as they posed in front of the venue. Tears flowed freely as Martha realized she might never see her home again. The insurance company had already told her over the phone that her policy would cover only a fraction of the rebuilding costs. At 68, with limited savings and no family nearby, the prospect of starting over seemed impossible. But as she turned the pages of her scrapbook, Martha found herself humming Amarillo by Morning under her breath. If George Strait's music had carried her through her husband's death, her battle with cancer, and countless other challenges, maybe it could carry her through this too. She had to believe that somehow, some way, she would find the strength to rebuild her life. What Martha didn't know was that her story was about to take a turn that would surprise everyone, including herself. The power of music, loyalty, and human kindness was about to reveal itself in ways she never could have imagined. And George Strait himself was about to learn just how profoundly his music had touched the life of one devoted fan who had lost everything except her faith and her love for country music. As Martha finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, clutching her scrapbook like a lifeline, she had no idea that a young volunteer named Ryan Thompson was about to change everything. Ryan Thompson had been volunteering at the Red Cross shelter for 3 days straight, surviving on coffee and determination. At 26, he was a struggling musician who played honky-tonk bars around San Antonio, dreaming of making it big in Nashville someday. His own apartment had been damaged in the flood, but not destroyed, so he felt compelled to help those who had lost everything. It was during his morning rounds on Thursday, distributing coffee and checking on the shelter residents, that Ryan first noticed Martha. She was sitting cross-legged on her air mattress, carefully turning the pages of what looked like a photo album, humming softly to herself. There was something about her quiet dignity that caught his attention, while others were openly grieving or angrily demanding answers from officials. Martha seemed to be finding peace in whatever she was looking at. "That's a beautiful song," Ryan said, crouching down beside her. "Amarillo by Morning, right?" Martha looked up, surprised that someone so young would recognize the classic George Strait tune. "You know George Strait?" "Know him? He's the reason I picked up a guitar," Ryan grinned. "My grandfather used to play his records when I was little. Said if you wanted to understand real country music, you started with George Strait." Martha's eyes lit up for the first time since the flood. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. George's music has been my companion through everything. My husband's death, my cancer battle, and now this." She opened her scrapbook wider, revealing page after page of concert tickets, photos, and memorabilia. Ryan's eyes widened as he realized the extent of her collection. "Ma'am, this is incredible. How many shows have you been to?" 37, Martha said with pride. "Started in 1983 and never stopped, even sold my wedding ring to afford tickets after Robert passed away. People thought I was crazy, but George's music was the only thing that made me feel alive again." Ryan sat down completely now, fascinated by Martha's story. She told him about catching the guitar pick in Austin, about how The Chair had played on the radio during her first chemotherapy session, and how she had driven 6 hours to Dallas just to hear George perform Troubadour live. Each story revealed another layer of loss and resilience, of a woman who had found hope in melody and lyrics when life had stripped away everything else. "You know what?" Ryan said, pulling out his phone. "Would you mind if I took a picture? I run a small social media page about local musicians and country music. I think people would love to hear your story." Martha hesitated. She had never been comfortable with social media or modern technology, but something about Ryan's earnest face and genuine interest convinced her. "I suppose it would be all right, but I probably look terrible after sleeping on this floor." "You look like someone who's lived a life worth telling," Ryan said gently. "That's the most beautiful thing in the world." He took several photos of Martha holding her scrapbook, her weathered hands contrasting with the vibrant memories preserved in its pages. In one shot, she was smiling while pointing to a photo of herself and Robert at that first concert in 1983. In another, she was holding up the precious guitar pick from Austin, her eyes sparkling with the memory. Ryan posted the photos that afternoon with a heartfelt caption, "Meet Martha Jenkins, a 73-year-old flood victim who lost everything except her faith and her love for George Strait. For 5 decades, his music has carried her through every tragedy and triumph. She's attended 37 concerts, sold her wedding ring to afford tickets after becoming a widow, and caught this guitar pick in Austin during her cancer treatment. If you've ever wondered about the power of music to heal and sustain the human spirit, look no further than Martha's story. She's currently living in a high school gymnasium, but she's still humming Amarillo by Morning every morning. Country music isn't just entertainment, it's medicine for the soul. Within hours, the post had been shared dozens of times. By evening, it had reached hundreds of people across Texas. Local country music fans began commenting with their own stories of how George Strait's music had touched their lives. Someone shared it in a Facebook group dedicated to Texas flood relief. Another person posted it on a forum for George Strait fans. Meanwhile, Martha was facing the harsh reality of her situation. That Thursday afternoon, she had met with a claims adjuster from her insurance company, a thin man in an expensive suit who seemed more interested in his phone than in her story. He explained that her policy would cover only about 30% of the rebuilding costs, and that was if she could prove the flood wasn't caused by groundwater seepage, which apparently wasn't covered. "Mrs. Jenkins, I need you to understand that insurance is a business," the adjuster said coldly. "We can't be responsible for every natural disaster that occurs. You'll receive a check for $15,000, which should be enough to get you started somewhere else." $15,000. Martha tried to process the number. Her house had been worth at least $80,000, and that was without counting the decades of memories and improvements she and Robert had made. The thought of starting over at 68 with such a small amount felt overwhelming. That evening, Martha sat in the shelter's makeshift cafeteria, picking at a donated sandwich while Max lay at her feet. Around her, other flood victims were having similar conversations with insurance adjusters, lawyers, and government officials. The stories were all the same, people who had lost everything being told that their policies wouldn't cover nearly enough to rebuild. "It's criminal," muttered Jose Hernandez, a man in his 50s who had lost his auto repair shop. "They take our premiums for years, then find every excuse not to pay when we need them." "What choice do we have?" asked Maria Santos, a single mother whose apartment had been completely destroyed. "We can't afford to fight them in court." Martha listened to the conversations around her, feeling a familiar helplessness wash over her. She had felt this way before, when Robert was diagnosed with terminal cancer, when she received her own cancer diagnosis, when she realized she was truly alone in the world. But each time, she had found a way to keep going, often with George Strait's voice, providing the soundtrack to her survival. She excused herself and walked to a quiet corner of the gymnasium where she could sit alone with her thoughts. Opening her scrapbook again, she found the program from George's concert in 2001, just 6 months after Robert's funeral. She had driven to Houston by herself, something she had never done before, just to hear him sing, "I Cross My Heart." That song had been her and Robert's wedding song, and hearing it performed live had felt like a final goodbye, a way of letting go while still holding on to love. "You holding up okay?" Ryan appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Martha accepted the coffee gratefully. "Just thinking about how many times I've had to start over. You'd think I'd be used to it by now." "Maybe that's your superpower," Ryan said. "Some people have the gift of starting over. Not everyone can do it." "I don't feel very powerful right now," Martha admitted. "The insurance money won't be enough to rebuild. My son wants me to move to Seattle, but I can't leave. Texas. This is where Robert and I built our life, where all my memories are. I don't know what I'm going to do." Ryan was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Have you thought about telling your story more publicly? I mean, beyond my little social media post. People need to hear about how the insurance companies are treating flood victims." Martha shook her head. "I'm not the type for publicity. I've always kept my troubles to myself." But maybe that's exactly why people need to hear from you, Ryan pressed. You're not looking for pity or handouts. You're just trying to rebuild your life with dignity. That's something people can relate to. Unknown to both of them, Ryan's post was continuing to spread across the internet. Someone had shared it in a Facebook group for country music industry professionals. A Nashville blogger had picked up the story and written a piece about the power of fan loyalty. Most importantly, someone from the management company that represented George Strait had seen the post and screenshot it to show their team. Back in the shelter, Martha was preparing for another sleepless night on the gym floor. The Red Cross volunteers had announced that the shelter would close in 10 days, and everyone needed to find alternative housing. Martha had been calling apartment complexes all day, but most required first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. Money she simply didn't have. She lay down on her air mattress. Max curled up beside her and opened her scrapbook to a random page. It was a photo from George's performance in San Antonio in 1995, the year she had been declared cancer-free. She remembered that night clearly. She had splurged on better seats to celebrate, and when George sang, "I'd like to have that one back," she had cried tears of joy instead of sadness for the first time in months. "We're going to figure this out, Max," she whispered to her dog. "We always do." But as she closed her eyes, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that this challenge might be bigger than anything she had faced before. She was older now, with fewer resources and less time to rebuild. The $15,000 from insurance wouldn't last long, and she had no idea where she would live or how she would afford to start over. What Martha didn't know was that her story was about to reach the one person who could change everything. George Strait himself was about to learn about the woman who had followed his career for 5 decades, who had found strength in his music through every tragedy life had thrown at her. And when he learned about her current situation, the legendary country star would make a decision that would surprise everyone, including his own management team. As Martha drifted off to sleep, humming "Check Yes or No" under her breath, fate was already setting in motion a series of events that would prove that sometimes the most powerful connections are forged not through fame or fortune, but through the simple act of caring about another human being's story. 300 miles away in Nashville, George Strait was sitting in his home studio going through potential songs for his next album when his phone buzzed with a text from his longtime manager, Tom Bradley. The message was simple. "You need to see this. Check your email." George had been in the music business long enough to know that urgent messages from his manager usually meant either very good news or very bad news. He opened his laptop and found an email with the subject line, "This fan story will break your heart." Attached was a screenshot of Ryan's social media post, along with a note from Tom. "George, this has been shared over 5,000 times in the past 2 days. The story is incredible, but what's happening to this woman is heartbreaking. Thought you should know." George studied the photos carefully. There was something familiar about the woman's face, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her. He read Ryan's caption twice, then clicked on the link to see the full post and comments. What he found there made him set down his coffee and pay closer attention. Comment after comment told similar stories of loss and resilience, but several mentioned seeing Martha at various George Strait concerts over the years. One fan wrote, "I remember her. She was at the Houston show in 2001, sitting 3 rows behind me. She cried during I Cross My Heart, and I wondered what her story was." Another commented, "This is the lady who caught your guitar. Big in Austin. I was there in 97 and everyone cheered when she caught it. She looked so happy." George felt a strange stirring in his chest. He had performed for millions of people over the decades, but the idea that this one woman had been there in the audience for 37 different shows, finding comfort in his music through every tragedy life had thrown at her. It was both humbling and deeply moving. He called Tom immediately. "I want to know everything about this woman's situation. Get me in touch with whoever posted this." "George, I figured you'd want to help," Tom said. "I've already had my assistant research the flood situation in San Antonio. It's bad, really bad. Hundreds of families have lost everything, and the insurance companies are being typical vultures." "What about Martha specifically? What's her real situation?" "According to what I could find, she's exactly what she appears to be. A 68-year-old retired nurse who lost her house in the flood. Her insurance is only covering about $15,000, nowhere near enough to rebuild. She's currently living in a high school gymnasium that's scheduled to close as a shelter in a week." George was quiet for a long moment. "Tom, I want to do something about this. Not just for her, but for all the flood victims. But I want to handle Martha's situation personally." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I need to make a trip to San Antonio, quietly, without any media attention. I want to meet this woman who's been supporting my career for 5 decades. George, you know how these things go. The minute you show up somewhere, it becomes a circus. Maybe we could arrange to have her come to Nashville, make it more private." "No," George said firmly. "She's been through enough. If I want to meet her, I go to her. Besides, I was born and raised in Texas. It's time I reminded people of that." Tom knew better than to argue. When George got that tone in his voice, "All right, let me reach out to the volunteer who posted this and see if we can arrange something discreet." Meanwhile, back in San Antonio, Martha was having the worst day since the flood. She had spent the morning on the phone with apartment complexes, only to be told repeatedly that her limited income and lack of recent rental history made her an undesirable tenant. The few places that would consider her required deposits she couldn't afford. Even worse, she had received a call from David, her son in Seattle, who had been researching her situation online. "Mom, I've been looking at the flood damage reports. Your whole neighborhood is destroyed. Even if you could afford to rebuild, it could take years. Please, just come stay with me and Sarah. We'll figure something out." Martha appreciated David's concern, but the thought of leaving Texas felt like giving up on everything she and Robert had built together. "I can't just abandon my whole life, David. This is where I belong." "But, Mom, you don't have anything. Left there, your house is gone, your neighborhood is gone. What are you holding on to?" Martha couldn't explain it in a way that would make sense to her son. How could she tell him that every mile of Texas highway held a memory of driving to see George Strait perform? That the smell of barbecue and the sound of fiddle music made her feel connected to Robert in ways she couldn't replicate in Seattle? That leaving Texas would feel like losing the last piece of her identity? That afternoon, Martha was sitting in the shelter's common area when a local news crew arrived to do a follow-up story on the flood victims. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a bright smile, was interviewing families about their recovery efforts. "We're looking for compelling human interest stories," the reporter told the Red Cross coordinator. "People who represent the resilience of the Texas spirit." Several residents volunteered to be interviewed, but Martha hung back. She had never been comfortable with attention, preferring to handle her problems privately. But when the reporter approached her directly, asking about the scrapbook she was holding, Martha found herself reluctantly agreeing to talk. "Tell me about what you lost in the flood," the reporter said, gesturing for her cameraman to start rolling. Martha took a deep breath. "I lost my house, my furniture, my garden, 43 years of making a home with my husband. But I saved this." She held up her scrapbook. "It might seem silly to some people, but this represents 50 years of finding joy in the darkest times. George Strait's music has been my constant companion through everything. My husband's death, my cancer battle, and now this." The reporter's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of story that would tug at viewers' heartstrings. Tell me about your devotion to George Strait. How many concerts have you attended? 37, Martha said with a small smile. Started in 1983 and never stopped. I even sold my wedding ring to afford tickets after my husband passed away. People thought I was crazy, but his music was the only thing that made me feel alive again. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Martha sharing stories about specific concerts and how George's songs had helped her through various challenges. She talked about catching the guitar pick in Austin during her cancer treatment, about driving 6 hours to Dallas just to hear Troubadour live, about how The Chair had played on the radio during her first chemotherapy session. What Martha didn't know was that this interview would air that evening on the local news, and that someone would post it on YouTube within hours. More importantly, she had no idea that George Strait himself was already planning to visit San Antonio, or that he had been deeply moved by her story. That evening, as Martha lay on her air mattress in the gymnasium, she noticed unusual activity around the shelter. More volunteers than usual were working late, and there seemed to be some kind of preparation happening. When she asked Ryan about it, he just smiled mysteriously and said, "Sometimes good things happen when you least expect them." Unknown to Martha, Ryan had been contacted by Tom Bradley that afternoon. The conversation had been brief but electrifying. George Strait wanted to meet Martha, and he wanted to do it at the shelter, without media attention, the very next day. Ryan had been sworn to secrecy, but the excitement was almost too much to contain. He had spent the afternoon helping coordinate with the Red Cross officials and ensuring that George's visit could happen without turning into a media circus. Only a handful of people knew what was planned. As Martha drifted off to sleep that night, she found herself thinking about the interview she had given. Part of her worried that she had shared too much, that she had made herself seem pathetic or desperate, but another part of her felt relieved to have finally told someone about the role George's music had played in her survival. She opened her scrapbook to a photo from the concert in 1992, shortly after Robert's cancer diagnosis. They had gone to that show together, knowing it might be one of their last opportunities to enjoy music together. George had performed I Cross My Heart that night, and she and Robert had slow danced in the aisle, not caring what anyone else thought. "I miss you, Robert," she whispered to the photo. "I don't know how I'm going to get through this one without you." But as she closed her eyes, Martha heard someone in the distance humming Amarillo by Morning. The familiar melody wrapped around her like a warm blanket, reminding her that she had survived impossible things before. Maybe, just maybe, she could survive this too. What Martha couldn't have imagined was that less than 12 hours later, she would come face to face with the man whose music had sustained her through 5 decades of joy and sorrow. George Strait was already on his way to San Antonio, carrying with him a plan that would change not just Martha's life, but the lives of dozens of other flood victims. What Martha couldn't have imagined was that less than 12 hours later, she would come face to face with the man whose music had sustained her through 5 decades of joy and sorrow. George Strait was already on his way to San Antonio, carrying with him a plan that would change not just Martha's life, but the lives of dozens of other flood victims. Friday morning arrived with an unusual buzz of energy in the shelter. Martha noticed it immediately. Volunteers were moving with more purpose. There were more official-looking people in suits walking around, and Ryan seemed barely able to contain his excitement about something. "You're acting strange today," Martha told him when he brought her coffee. "What's going on?" "Just a good day to be alive," Ryan said, grinning widely. "Hey, there's going to be a community meeting at 10 o'clock about flood recovery resources. You should come." Martha wasn't particularly interested in another meeting about resources she couldn't access, but she had nothing else to do. She spent the morning helping other residents organize their belongings and trying to calm Max, who seemed to sense the unusual energy in the building. At exactly 10 o'clock, Martha found herself in the gymnasium, along with about 50 other flood victims. A small stage had been set up at one end, with a microphone and a few chairs. Red Cross officials and local government representatives were seated in the front row, but there was an empty chair that seemed to be waiting for someone important. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the Red Cross coordinator, "we have a special guest today who wanted to speak with you about recovery efforts and community support." Martha settled into her folding chair, expecting to hear from another politician or bureaucrat. She was only half listening when she heard the coordinator say, "Please welcome someone who needs no introduction, a true son of Texas." The gymnasium erupted in gasps and screams as George STRAIT walked onto the stage. Martha's coffee cup fell from her hands, shattering on the concrete floor. She sat frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. This had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But it wasn't a dream. George STRAIT, wearing jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt, was standing less than 30 feet away from her. He looked exactly as she had always imagined he would look in person, tall, dignified, with those kind eyes that had always seemed to speak directly to her soul through his music. "Good morning," George said into the microphone, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had comforted Martha through countless sleepless nights. "I know this is unexpected and I apologize for the surprise, but when I heard about what happened to your community, I knew I had to come see for myself." The crowd was still buzzing with excitement and disbelief. Several people were taking photos with their phones, but George raised his hand gently. "I'd appreciate if we could keep this between us for now. I'm not here for publicity. I'm here because you're my neighbors, and neighbors help neighbors." Martha felt tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe this was real. After 50 years of loving this man's music from afar, he was here, in the same room, talking about helping her community. "I've been reading about your situations," George continued, "and I want you to know that what the insurance companies are doing to you is wrong. You shouldn't have to lose everything and then be told you're on your own. That's not how we do things in Texas." He paused, scanning the crowd, and Martha could swear his eyes lingered on her for just a moment. "I'm here today to announce the creation of a fund to help with rebuilding efforts. Not just token help, but real assistance to get you back on your feet with dignity." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Martha was crying so hard she could barely see, but she clapped until her hands hurt. This was impossible, miraculous, too good to be true. But George wasn't finished. "There's someone specific I came here to meet today, someone who's been supporting my career for a very long time, and who represents everything I admire about the Texas spirit." Martha's heart stopped. He couldn't possibly mean. "Is Martha Jenkins here?" George asked, shading his eyes as he looked out into the crowd. Every head in the gymnasium turned toward Martha. She sat paralyzed, unable to move or speak. This couldn't be happening. This was too much, too overwhelming. "Martha," George said again, his voice gentle, "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Ryan appeared at her side, helping her to her feet. "Come on, Martha, he's here for you." On shaking legs, Martha made her way toward the stage. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something special. When she reached the edge of the stage, George stepped down to meet her at ground level. "Hello, Martha," he said, extending his hand. "I'm George. I've heard so much about you." Martha couldn't speak. She just stared at him, this man whose voice had been her companion through every major event of her adult life. Finally, she managed to whisper, "You're real." George laughed, a warm sound that filled the gymnasium. "I'm real, and I'm honored to meet you. I understand you've been to a few of my shows over the years." 37, Martha said, finding her voice. 37 shows since 1983. "I know," George said softly, "and I want you to know that your loyalty means more to me than I can express. Your story, your strength through everything you've endured. It's why I make music. It's why any of us make music." Martha was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of joy, of completion, of a dream she never dared to have coming true. "I heard about your house," George continued, "and I heard about what the insurance company told you. That's not acceptable, not for someone who's given as much as you have." "I don't need charity," Martha said, surprising herself with her firmness. "I've always taken care of myself." "This isn't charity," George said. "This is community. This is what we do for each other. And besides, I have a proposition for you." Martha looked at him questioningly. "I'd like to rebuild your house," George said. "Not just rebuild it, but make it better. I want to create something that honors what you and your husband built together, but also gives you the space you need for the future. I heard you wanted to add a room for your grandson." Martha's knees buckled. Ryan and George both reached out to steady her. "I can't. I couldn't accept. It's too much." "Martha," George said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had made up his mind completely. "Do you know how many people have told me over the years that my music helped them through? Or times, thousands, but I've never met anyone who lived it the way you have. 37 shows. Selling your wedding ring to afford tickets, catching that guitar pick in Austin when you were fighting cancer." Martha's eyes widened. "You remember that?" "I remember seeing you in the front row that night. I remember thinking, you looked like you needed that pick more than anyone else in the arena. I threw it right to you on purpose." A sob escaped Martha's throat. All these years, she had treasured that guitar pick, thinking it was just a lucky catch. To learn that George had intentionally thrown it to her, that he had seen her pain and tried to give her a moment of joy, was almost too much to process. "The thing is," George continued, "you've been giving me something for 50 years. You've been showing up, supporting the music, keeping the faith when times were hard. You've been part of my extended family without even knowing it. Now it's my turn to show up for you." The entire gymnasium was silent except for the sound of people crying. Everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment of pure human connection that transcended celebrity and fame. "I don't know what to say," Martha whispered. "Say you'll let me help," George said. "Say you'll let me be part of your story, the way you've been part of mine." Martha looked around the gymnasium at the faces of her fellow flood victims, all of whom were watching with expressions of hope and amazement. She thought about Robert, about how he would have loved this moment, about how he always said that good things happened to good people if you waited long enough. "Yes," she said finally, "yes, I'll let you help." George smiled and pulled her into a gentle hug. The gymnasium erupted in applause and cheers. When they separated, George turned to address the crowd again. "Martha's house is going to be the first project of the Texas Flood Recovery Fund," he announced, "but it won't be the last. We're going to make sure everyone here gets the help they need to rebuild, not just their homes, but their lives." As the crowd continued to cheer, Martha felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Ryan, who was grinning from ear to ear. "I told you sometimes good things happen when you least expect them," he said. But the surprises weren't over. George had one more announcement that would change everything, not just for Martha, but for the entire community. As the applause died down, he stepped back up to the microphone with a look of determination that suggested he was about to make the kind of decision that would be remembered for years to come. "There's something else," George said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the gymnasium lean forward. "Something I've been thinking about during my drive down here from Nashville." Martha, still standing near the stage, felt her heart racing. What more could possibly happen? This day had already exceeded every dream she'd ever had. "You know, I've been performing for over 40 years, George continued, and I've been blessed beyond measure by the support of fans like Martha. But today, meeting her, hearing all your stories, seeing what you've been through, it's reminded me why I got into music in the first place." He paused, his eyes finding Martha's in the crowd. It wasn't for the fame or the money. It was to connect with people, to be part of their lives in some small way. And today, I realized that sometimes the best way to connect is to show up, not just on stage, but in real life. George pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Tom, it's me. Remember that conversation we had about the private concert for the Austin Children's Hospital? Cancel it. I've got something more important to do." The gymnasium was completely silent now, everyone hanging on his every word. "I want to invite all of you to be my guests at a special concert," George announced. "Not in some big arena, but right here in San Antonio. We're going to set up a stage in Brackenridge Park, and I'm going to perform for free for every flood victim in this city. No tickets, no VIP sections, just music for people who need it." The crowd exploded in cheers, but George held up his hand. "That's not all. I'm also announcing that I'm moving the headquarters of the Texas Flood Recovery Fund right here to San Antonio. I want to be hands-on with this project, and I want Martha to help me run it." Martha's jaw dropped. "Me? But I don't know anything about running a fund." "You know about surviving," George said simply. "You know about what people need when they've lost everything. That's more valuable than any business degree." Over the next several weeks, Martha's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. True to his word, George had a construction crew breaking ground on her new house within days. But more than that, he visited the construction site almost daily, sometimes bringing his guitar and playing for the workers during their lunch breaks. Martha found herself in the surreal position of working alongside her musical hero, learning about construction permits and insurance claims while listening to him hum new songs he was working on. The man she had admired from afar for 50 years turned out to be exactly who she had hoped he would be: kind, genuine, and deeply committed to helping others. "You know," George said one afternoon as they watched the framers put up the walls of her new house, "I've been thinking about that guitar pick you caught in Austin. I still have it," Martha said, patting the small purse she carried everywhere. "I've carried it with me every day since 1997. "I want you to keep it," George said, "but I also want to give you something else." He reached into his guitar case and pulled out a beautiful acoustic guitar. "This is the guitar I used to record my first album. I've been saving it for someone special." Martha's hands trembled as she accepted the instrument. "George, I can't play guitar." "Then I'll teach you," he said with a smile. "We've got time." The free concert in Brackenridge Park became the stuff of legend. Over 10,000 people attended, including flood victims from across South Texas. George performed for 3 hours, playing every song Martha had ever requested, and several he had written specifically for the occasion. The highlight of the evening came when he called Martha on stage and dedicated "I Cross My Heart" to her and Robert's memory. "This song is for Martha Jenkins," George announced to the crowd, "who taught me that the greatest gift we can give each other is showing up when it matters most." As the months passed, Martha's new house took shape. It was larger than her old one, with a beautiful guest room for her grandson and a music room where she could display her George Strait memorabilia and practice the guitar he had given her. But more importantly, it was built to withstand future floods, with elevated foundations and modern drainage systems. The Texas Flood Recovery Fund, with Martha as its community liaison, helped rebuild over 200 homes and businesses. Martha discovered she had a talent for connecting with people and understanding their needs, skills that proved invaluable in distributing aid fairly and effectively. But perhaps the most surprising development was the relationship that formed between Martha and George's family. When his grandson came to visit one weekend, Martha found herself playing the role of surrogate grandmother, teaching the boy about Texas history and introducing him to the other flood victims she had befriended. "You know what I love about Martha?" George told a reporter who was doing a follow-up story on the fund. "She never asks for anything for herself. Every conversation we have is about how we can help someone else. That's the Texas spirit right there." The culmination of this incredible journey came on a warm evening in October, 6 months after the flood. Martha was sitting on the porch of her new house, strumming the guitar George had given her and practicing Amarillo by Morning, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You're getting better," George said, settling into the rocking chair beside her. Robert would be proud. Martha looked out at her new neighborhood, where several other flood victims had rebuilt their homes with help from the fund. Children were playing in the yards, and the sound of laughter filled the air. "I think he would be proud of all of this," she said. "I have one more surprise for you," George said, pulling out an envelope. "Open it." Inside was a deed to the music room in her new house, officially naming it the Robert and Martha Jenkins Music Education Center. "I've arranged for music teachers to come here twice a week to give free lessons to kids in the neighborhood. Your house is going to be the heart of a musical community." Martha couldn't speak through her tears. The idea that her home would become a place where children could discover the joy of music, the same joy that had sustained her through every challenge, was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. "There's something else," George continued. "I want you to know that meeting you changed my life too. For too many years, I've been separated from my fans by stadiums and security guards. You reminded me that the real magic happens when we connect as human beings, not as celebrity and fan." As the sun set over San Antonio, Martha reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything in the flood, but she had gained something she never expected: a true friendship with the man whose music had been her constant companion and the opportunity to help others in ways she never dreamed possible. That night, Martha called her son David in Seattle. "I've been thinking about your invitation to move up there," she said. "Really? You'd consider it?" "No," Martha said with a laugh. "I'm calling to invite you to come visit me instead. I want you to see what we've built here. I want you to meet George and see the music center. I want you to understand why I could never leave Texas." "George! As in George Strait?" "As in my friend George," Martha said, savoring the impossible reality of those words. The story of Martha Jenkins and George Strait became a testament to the power of loyalty, kindness, and showing up when it matters most. Martha's house became a gathering place for the community, hosting music lessons, neighborhood barbecues, and fundraising events for other disaster victims across Texas. And every evening, Martha would sit on her porch with her guitar, playing the songs that had carried her through 5 decades of joy and sorrow, knowing that sometimes the most beautiful melodies come not from the radio, but from the connections we make with each other along the way. The guitar pick from Austin still sat in a place of honor on her mantelpiece, but now it was joined by photos of her and George working together, laughing together, and proving that sometimes the most powerful relationships are built not on fame or fortune, but on the simple recognition that we all need someone to show up for us when life gets hard. Martha Jenkins had lost everything in the flood, but she had found something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that she was loved, valued, and that her story mattered. And George Strait had rediscovered the reason he fell in love with music in the first place: its power to heal, to connect, and to remind us that we're never truly alone as long as we have each other.